Hi everyone, welcome to this video. I hope you're doing well. In this video, I'll give you a brief introduction to what I refer to in other videos as the rhizomatic structure of the archetype. So the rhizomatic structure of the collective unconscious. Now, what I mean by that is I'll offer you a metaphor to understand the sort of the collective unconscious that Carl Jung proposes in a different perspective, in a lot more detail, and perhaps this will clarify some of the sort of functions or dynamics of the collective unconscious for you, because I think sometimes a metaphorical image will open a space to a sort of a deeper understanding of precisely what we want to achieve. Now, to sort of understand what we're doing here, you'll have to have some, I would say, basic knowledge of Carl Jung's quest. So essentially, Carl Jung, psychoanalyst working around the turn of the 20th century, wanted to propose a sort of, or expand the sort of perspective of the psyche that Sigmund Freud proposed, where the psyche was essentially split between consciousness or the ego, and then sort of an unconscious realm that was essentially a repository of repressed content, structured or not structured, however it was purely personal. Now, Jung proposed that there's a non-personal layer to the unconscious that he referred to as the collective unconscious. Now, this collective unconscious for Jung is a layer of the psyche that we as psychic beings or subjects are born into. So as I think Edward Edinger writes this, the self is born, the ego is made. Now, the self is the personal aspect of the collective, right? The sort of the microcosm of the macrocosm, if you will, that we're all born into, and the ego for those thinkers, for the Jungian thinkers, is sort of created in the process of sort of self-creation, if you want, or self-narration even. Now, let me propose the metaphor to you, and then we'll get into sort of analyzing it in more detail. So, essentially, imagine you have a plane. So, let's say your garden, right? Imagine you have your garden. And your garden is composed of a lot of stuff you see on the surface, like grass or trees or whatever it is, right? Whatever you have in your garden, plants. And then under the surface, there's an elaborate structure of roots. Now, those roots, imagine, this is a metaphor, right? This is not botanically correct. But the roots, imagine the roots to be interconnected. So they're all mingling with each other. They're all sort of connected to each other, essentially, to form one big structure that we may refer to as the root, like the root structure. Here, every single root plays an important role to connect or be connected with every other root, right? And now imagine in the structure, there occurs the formation of certain nuclei or sort of, let's say, cores, like certain points within the root that are more pronounced than others. Now, the reason why they're more pronounced than others is that those structures occur more often. Now, to imagine that, you'll have to assume that the same kind of root will cluster around a sort of an imaginary core. So the same kind of root will come together and form a cluster. Now, basically, you can imagine, in this case, let's say the same color root, right? There's different colors of roots, there's blue roots, there's yellow roots, whatever. So the same kind of color will cluster together. Now, what will happen is that colors are not fixed. Like green isn't suddenly, like when is green and not blue anymore, right? Like, but colors are just like gradients, right? And so you'll have this sort of gradient shaped, basically, rainbow with different sort of clusters, and then at the margins of those clusters, you'll have content that barely fits the clusters, but sort of just another cluster, and so you'll have those clusters also indicating sort of a measure of difference, a difference score kind of thing, right? To the core itself, to the mean of the cluster, right? Now, what's interesting about this is that if you look at the individual elements above the surface, right? The the tree, let's say, and the particular structure of the tree's roots, and this is where the metaphor is sort of a bit of a stretch, is that each of those tree roots, now there are a billion different tree roots, right? But each of those particular tree roots, what Jung would call the self, is a representation of the whole, right? So each of those tree roots is sort of a microcosm in the Platonic sense of the macrocosm that is the whole structure of the roots. Now, what this implies, and we'll get to this in a bit more detail later, is that if something changes on the level of the whole, the same thing changes on the level of the individual, right? Although the individual obviously has its individual aspect, let's say, or individual focus of the sort of the whole is still reflected within the individual dynamically and sort of on a live basis, right? Now, the idea with this individual reflection or this individual shape of the individual sort of structure of the root is that while the whole is represented within the individual structure, there is still the sort of a sort of nuanced difference between the different sort of individual clusters, and this nuanced difference expresses, let's say, in the conductivity or thickness of the individual strings or clusters. That's how I like to think about it. So there's a difference in, let's say, if you think about it as instruments, right? There's a difference. Although two guitars are essentially, they're the same kind of instrument, there's still a nuanced difference in the way the body of resonance is shaped, right? And this is what I like to think about in the context of how the self as sort of an individual structure expresses as different to the whole. Now the thing is, I'll have to give a little bit of a precaution here, because essentially the question arises whether the self is actually different from the whole of the collective, right? That's an important question in Jung, and I think it's not clearly answered, right? Because the self ultimately is the first time everything is, right? Like we're born into the self, right? Which is everything in that sense, and the self is also the only aspect in which we can actually sort of deduct or deduce a connection to something that is larger than us, right? Because if we talk about a connection to the collective unconscious properly without the self, then the self would become kind of unnecessary, right? So I think there is a level in which we have to say that the self is actually everything, and then the limit that is imposed, so the individual aspect that is imposed upon the root structure of the individual tree, is induced by it, by sort of the emergence of the ego, and it just appears to be limited, but it's actually whole, right? There's actually no such thing as an individual structure, properly speaking, right, if you will. Now I don't know if this is true, and again, like, it's probably, we'd have to look at the source material, but I think it's an hypothesis to have, right? But now let's look at some of the structural deductions that we can make from this metaphor, right? We've now established the metaphor to a large extent, and now if we talk about the structural deductions from this metaphor, we will come to see it in more detail. And first of all, we see that essentially, as I said, the whole of the macrocosm is always reflected in the microcosm of the one root. So when something changes in the macrocosm, in the large picture, something also changes in the small picture of the individual, right? Now, the question is, and secondly, everything is connected. We also see that each of these different cores or clusters within the root are connected to all other ones, so they influence each other sort of laterally. But now, to raise a question here is, how does the change actually occur here in this space? And the answer is, I would say, the answer returns us to this idea of the movement of the psyche between sort of the world levels. So this gesture of sacrifice that we've discussed in other videos, right? The gesture of sacrifice being the hero's journey, metaphorically, essentially revealing that the hero moves into sort of an unknown space, and that would actually be the space above the surface that the root cannot access, and then bringing back something to the root that it has found, right? And the idea here is that sort of that this something would be a seed that then unfolds underneath the surface, and potentially unfolds as a tree above the surface, as a new tree above the surface, as a new psyche, so as a new child, right? Essentially. But I think it's quite an interesting notion to think about this gesture of sacrifice actually as a response to the blindness of the root structure, right? Like there's a necessity to move back into the whole, right, the cultural structure, because the cultural structure is essentially blind and therefore tyrannical, right? And that's how transformation occurs, right? By essentially this root or the content of the root, sort of reflexively clusters to those aspects to which it's most alike. And this is actually, by the way, the whole structure is very much akin to a neural network, to structure of a neural network, right? If we think about the way the brain works, it's very similar to this structure, right? Where you have similar elements, you're clustering with other similar elements. You have this lateral influence, where there's an inhibition or excitation impulses coming from sort of, mediation layers, and so there's a lot of similarities between these two metaphors, and obviously one is influenced by the other. The Rhizome metaphor is influenced by the neural network dynamics, right? But so let's sort of bring this back to the level of the psyche and talk about some of the consequences in more detail. So basically on the level of the psyche, you obviously have the collective unconscious, that is sort of the root structure, right? The rhizomatic structure itself would be the collective unconscious. Now the subject would be that which arises sort of above the surface, right, as consciousness, and splitting off, essentially differentiating from the whole over time, right, but always staying in a relationship to it. And what is really interesting, and Jung pointed this out clearly, is that there is a relationship of the collective unconscious to the subject, in which the collective unconscious provides the subject with the energy it needs to exist, right? And that's actually quite interesting, because we can think about in the root structure, in the context of the structure of the root, we can think about different thicknesses of these roots influencing sort of the conductivity of the elements that these roots stand in for, right? These clusters, nuclei, whatever we call them, are essentially the archetypes, right? The archetypal cores, right? But now, if we think about this in the context of of conductivity, right, we can now understand the aspect that we've talked about a lot, namely the fact that the core, the nucleus of the complexes, mediates the psychic energy of the sort of the unfolding of the ego, right? And that's, I think, actually one of the most interesting consequences. But also we see that the sort of the dynamic of the archetypes is actually reflected in this metaphor, right? The fact that the archetypes are developed or sort of shaped by the individual acting upon the archetypes, right? So there's lots to gain in this metaphor, I believe. And in conclusion, what I think this metaphor gives us is simply another framework to think through the structuring of the unconscious. Right? It's not entirely precise. It's not a metaphor Jung proposed, but it's a metaphor we can use to sort of bounce off some of these ideas that we've been putting forth, and sort of also come to a closer understanding of this position of the ego or the subject within sort of this entangled within this realm of the psychic development as a whole, right? Not only on the individual level. Now, thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in. If you like this video, then please do consider to subscribe to my channel. Also give the video a thumbs up, obviously, and do leave a comment below. I'll appreciate your feedback. Thank you.